Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 18. Sometime later, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. And God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up, loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said. "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And he reached out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. The angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." This is one of the most remarkable and maybe challenging accounts in the Bible. And how many times have people read this and asked, why would God do this? Why would God ask somebody to sacrifice their own child? Surely this can't be right. And how many of us have wondered what was going through Abraham's mind when he set off, apparently prepared to kill his only son on an altar? As we head into 2025, I've chosen a verse from this passage to be our motto verse for the year. Simon Nobbs brought us a motto verse last year. Can any of you remember it?
Did you forget it? Those who are called by my name will basically submit and confess their sin before me, then God will bless us and forgive us.
That's the one. 2 Chronicles 17. "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will forgive their sin and heal their land." This year's motto verse is somewhat shorter, and it's taken from Genesis 22:14. The Lord will provide. I do have some what's here for you to take away at the end, to put somewhere to remind yourself through the year. The Lord will provide. And as we think about that verse and this episode from the Bible, there's 3 lessons that I'd like us to take away with us. And the first is to note Abraham's absolute obedience to God's call. Abraham had been told by God that his offspring, that there would be a great nation, that this nation would come through Isaac. But now God had called on Abraham to travel to a distant place and offer his son as a sacrifice. And it doesn't seem to make any sense. All of Abraham and Sarah's hopes and dreams for the future, all that they'd invested so much emotion in, the very promise of God, was apparently to be killed. Surely this couldn't be what God wanted. But Abraham knew that God had spoken to him. And he knew that God was to be obeyed and trusted. So he set off with his son to the region of Moriah to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. He obeyed despite the potential cost of doing so. If any of us ever read this passage, but what would we do? Could we have gone through with this the way Abraham did? Would we be like in a situation where God called us to do something so incredibly costly? Now I trust that none of us will ever have to make a choice quite like the one that Abraham appeared to be faced with. But we do make choices every single day about whether to obey God or not. And sometimes choosing to obey God means there will be a cost. There is always a cost involved in choosing to follow God and obey Him. I've never liked to push tithing. It worries me when pastors stand at the front and sort of press the idea of tithing on a church, or make it a condition of membership, as some churches do. But the Bible does give us a precedent that says that 10% of all that we have automatically just belongs to God. We should just give that straight to Him without even thinking. That anything else we give on top of that is our gift. That the 10% isn't even a gift, that's just God's. Obeying that precedent in the Bible means a cost, especially during a time when the cost of living is going up and up and up and people are struggling. We all face situations where being honest will cost us. But we know that's what God wants from His children. Some of you here will be called to works for God that will be testing and challenging. It will cost to follow that calling. We're all called to witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ within our families and friends and neighbours and colleagues and strangers. It will cost. We're called to be prayer warriors. That is going to cost us in terms of time. We have to set aside time every day to really wrestle with prayer, as the Bible calls us to. Some might be led by God to leave their country, or change jobs, or go back to their country, or give up work, or start voluntary work, or move house, or live in a particular area, maybe not an area of their choice. I know a pastor recently called to a church in Grimsby. How about that for obedience? Good man. One less church for me to get called to in Grimsby. These are decisions that will cost us if we obey them. What happened here between Abraham and God was absolutely unprecedented. And there are no parallels for any other regular human father-son relationships in the Bible. It was unique, but it provides us with a guide for obedience. Abraham obeyed because he knew that the Lord would provide. He obeyed even though there might be a cost, because he knew and trusted God's character. We have no idea how old Isaac was when this incident took place. It simply says sometime later. Was he a toddler, a young boy, a teen, young adult? People have speculated over the years and looked for evidence to try and work it out. But however old he was old enough to realise that something was amiss. In verse 7, he realised that his dad had everything needed for the sacrifice except one thing. Where is the lamb? He astutely asks. Well, how did Abraham feel in that moment when his son looked at him with that question? But he trusted God. He trusted the God who he knew. Verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb, he adds. Perhaps he had an inkling that God would stop him from carrying out the sacrifice. Hebrews 11 suggests that Abraham believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead. In verse 6, when he says to the servants, you wait here when I will take Isaac up there, he says, we will come back to you. So he knows that there's evidence here that he has faith that he and Isaac are going to come back. He knew the power and the nature of God, and he trusted God to be the God who would provide. Do you remember the account in Matthew's Gospel when the Sadducees come and question Jesus about the resurrection? That they ask Jesus that silly trick question about the woman who married a man who died before they had a child, so she married the brother who died, so she married the next brother who died, so she married the next 7 brothers in all of whom died in turn without a child. And they say, well, at the resurrection, whose wife would she be? As if that somehow completely disproved any idea of there being a resurrection. Remember Jesus answered to them? He said, you are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. What a put down for people who set themselves up as teachers. It says you don't know God or his power. Abraham, he knew God, and he knew God's power. He knew his nature, and so he trusted that God would provide. And what about us? We have the scriptures, we have the Bible, which reveal the power and the nature of God in every chapter. We have our own experience of how God has dealt with us. We've got the accounts of the people around us. It's why it's so important for us to share those accounts, to talk to one another about what God has done for us. Constantly encouraging and reinforcing in everybody else in the church, this is the nature of God, the God who did this amazing thing for me. We've got the lessons from 2,000 years of church history But when I first started the church history module as my studies, I thought it was going to be the most dry and boring module in the pack. Actually, it was brilliant. It was just so good. See the amazing way that God had worked through the church over 2,000 years of church history. There is no excuse for us not knowing the nature and the power of God. We have all the evidence around us to show us, to prove to us, to reinforce in our heads that God will provide. He always has provided, and He always will provide. If He calls us to do something, or He calls us to make a sacrifice, He will provide every single thing that we need in order to enable us to do it. If we give up finances, He will still provide for us. If we give up time, He will redeem it. If we lose friends or families because they turn against us, because we share the gospel with them, He will give us so many more brothers and sisters within the church. If we follow His call to do a particular job, He will provide the skills that we need to do that job. God's very nature and His character told Abraham that he could trust God despite the terrifying thing that he was called to do. His nature told Abraham he could trust Him. His nature tells us that we can trust God. He will provide. As a church, we're about to spend the majority of our money repairing the roof over the porch there. We are if the builder ever turns up anyway. He's not coming tomorrow like he said he would. But after that, there's work on the roof down at the manse. We're trusting that God will provide. As individuals, each of us can trust that God will provide. He will not call us to do something and not provide everything that we need to enable us to do it. Abraham trusted God because he knew His nature. So can we. In this passage, we get a sneak peek forward as well. There's so much going on here in this episode between Abraham and Isaac that foreshadows what God was going to do through Jesus Christ for us. Because He provided for our greatest need. Verse 14 is where I've taken our motto verse for the year from. The Lord will provide. But if you look at it, you'll see the verse goes on to say more than that. It continues on to say that on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. When Mandy and I visited Jerusalem, probably the loveliest place that we went to was the Garden Tomb, which may or may not be the place where Jesus was crucified and buried. But there was a guided tour happening. If you turn up as a church group, they put on a tour for you and take you round. We were there, just the two of us, and they said, if you want to tag along and listen in and get the guided tour, feel free to do so, which was lovely. And we didn't sort of follow them all the way round, but we were sat at the point where you can see the rock with the shape of a skull in there, and it's an amazing thing to look at and think, well, maybe this is the place of the skull mentioned when you see that skull in the rock, and then you look down and see this incredibly busy bus stop at the bottom of it, which sort of ruins the picture slightly. So you turn your gaze back up here and look at this. And the man doing the guided tour was taking this church around, and he stood there looking up at the rock, and he was pointing out with a laser where you could see the skull in there. And he said, this is not only the place where Jesus was crucified, this is where Abraham brought his son Isaac all those thousands of years before. And I looked about, is it? Is he sure about that? I'm not convinced. All it says here is that he went to the region of Moriah and a mountain that God would show him. I've no idea where Moriah is, and I don't know where the particular... Anyway, I was sceptical to say the least. Sometime later, I was reading 2 Chronicles, and this account of the building of the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the place provided by David. The remote place where Abraham had taken his son and been prepared to give up his own son was the site of the city of Jerusalem. Exactly the same mountain? I don't know, but certainly it was that place, that city. The same place where Abraham had gone through this experience was where Jesus was going to be offered as a sacrifice for the sins of everybody who would put their faith in him. It's on the mountain of the Lord. It was provided. The greatest need for every human is to have their sin forgiven and to be reunited into a relationship with God the Father. And that can only happen if our sin is paid for. On the mountain of the Lord, the price was paid for our sin. God provided what we need most. Verse 18, God says to Abraham, through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed. And the word offspring is really important there because it's singular. It's not talking about the nation of Israel that was going to come from him. Lots of people. It was talking about an offspring. One particular human descendant of Abraham. These words looked forward to Jesus Christ, who was going to die in the very place where Abraham was standing to offer a sacrifice there. Jesus was going to be offered as a sacrifice for the sins of people from all across the world, for the sins of everybody who would come to God in confession of their sin and faith in the one who died for them. Oh yes, on the mountain of the Lord it was provided. I've already said that we can trust what we know of God's character and his nature from Scripture and from our experience and from other Christians. But there's one further thing that assures us that God will provide, and it is the cross. Thousands of years before the birth of Jesus, God took Abraham along with his miracle-born son to this hill and had him act out the sacrifice that would take place there in years to come. God already knew the price that he would pay in order for us to become children of God. God the Son, part of God's own being, another miracle-born child, was crucified in the same place as a sacrifice, as a sin offering and a fellowship offering, to restore sinful people like us to God our Father. On the mountain of the Lord, our greatest need was provided for. When we have doubts about God's character, remember what he did for you. When you wonder if God will provide, remember what he provided for you on that hill. When you wonder about obeying God, remember his character. The character and the nature of one who died on a cross so that you could be his child. a God who provided everything that you needed then and will always provide everything that you need. He will not let you down. As we head into 2025 with all the uncertainties and the challenges that it's going to bring, cling on to this one great biblical truth, that the Lord will provide.